On September 16, 2025, an ordinary afternoon on the East Lancashire Road turned into a moment that would make national headlines. Traffic moved steadily between Liverpool and Manchester, until officers from Merseyside Police noticed a black VW Crafter van behaving suspiciously. At around 4:30 p.m, they brought it to a stop. The driver, 46-year-old Paul Farrelly from Farrell, appeared calm, but his unease grew as the questioning continued. When officers searched the vehicle, they discovered 22 sacks of ketamine stacked in the back. Then, behind hollowed-out kitchen worktops, they found 13 more. 35 sacks in total, around 875 kilograms of ketamine, with an estimated street value of £17 million. It was the largest single haul of its kind ever seized in the United Kingdom. How did one man end up behind the wheel of a van carrying a fortune in drugs? And what choices led him to that road on that day? Stories like this fade quickly once the headlines move on. If you don't subscribe now, you may never hear the truths buried beneath the surface. Paul Farrelly was born on April 6, 1979, and raised in Farrell, a quiet, working-class suburb in North Liverpool. The area has long been known for its strong community spirit but also for the challenges that come with economic decline. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Liverpool was struggling. Factories were closing, jobs were disappearing, and for many young people, opportunity felt out of reach. In neighborhoods like Farrell, crime wasn't always seen as distant, it was part of the landscape. From petty thefts and counterfeit goods to small-scale drug dealing, the lines between survival and criminality were often blurred. Farrelly grew up in that environment. Friends spoke of him as quiet and hard-working, but like so many of his generation, he faced limited choices. The lure of quick money, the promise of something better, was everywhere. By his early 20s, Liverpool's streets had already become key routes in the UK's growing trade in cocaine, cannabis, and ketamine. The networks were expanding, and they needed drivers, couriers, and people who could be trusted to move product without drawing attention. For men like Farrelly, those opportunities came dressed as legitimate work, delivery runs, haulage jobs, and cash-in-hand errands that no one asked too many questions about. But each delivery brought him closer to the people who made real money, the suppliers, importers, and middlemen who kept the trade alive. He may not have known it then, but every journey behind the wheel was another step deeper into a world built on secrecy and control, a world where trust was currency, and betrayal could cost far more than freedom. What began as routine work would soon place Paul Farrelly in the center of one of the largest drug seizures in British history. While there is little public record of Paul Farrelly's early offences, one thing is clear: traffickers rarely start big. The drug trade doesn't hand out million-pound shipments to strangers. It begins small. Quiet runs. Local errands. Deliveries that look legitimate on the surface. For men like Farrelly, those first jobs were simple: collect a package, drive it from one end of the city to the other, and ask no questions. The pay was good, the risks seemed low, and the people giving instructions carried the kind of quiet authority that didn't invite argument. Liverpool's transport routes, from its docks to the East Lancashire Road, had long been exploited by organised crime groups. Over the years, Merseyside Police and the National Crime Agency identified the region as a key hub in the movement of drugs across the northwest. To the traffickers, drivers like Farrelly were essential. Reliable. Unremarkable. The kind of man who could pass a roadside stop without raising suspicion. Each completed delivery built his reputation as someone who turned up on time, never asked questions, and never spoke out of turn. But in this world, trust comes with a price. Every favor owed. Every secret kept. Every successful run tied him closer to people whose operations reached far beyond Liverpool's estates. It wasn't glamour or power that pulled him in, it was routine. Familiar faces. A bit of cash. And then, a job too big to refuse. And soon, one job would take him far beyond Liverpool's suburbs. By the early 2020s, ketamine had become one of Britain's fastest-growing illicit drugs. Once used medically as an anesthetic, it had taken over club scenes, private parties, and dark web markets across the country. According to UK government data, seizures of ketamine had risen sharply year after year, and so had the profits. What had once been a niche drug was now a multi-million-pound trade. Organized networks adapted quickly. They began importing larger shipments, often from European and Asian sources, concealing the drugs within legitimate cargo, furniture, frozen goods, and building materials. For Paul Farrelly, this was the world he'd learned to navigate, quiet, methodical, and loyal to those who paid well. Investigators later revealed that traffickers used kitchen worktops to hide vast quantities of ketamine, compartments so carefully built that even trained eyes could miss them at a glance. It was a method of concealment that relied on precision, patience, and planning. Farrelly's job was simple on paper: transport what looked like ordinary goods from one point to another. But inside those hollowed worktops lay millions of pounds worth of drugs. Each run made him more valuable, more trusted, more entangled. The operations grew more sophisticated, the stakes higher. Yet success in this world always carries an invisible timer. Every trip another roll of the dice, every delivery another step closer to exposure. And one afternoon, on the East Lancashire Road, everything changed. Most people scroll past stories like this, until the same routes run through their own towns. Subscribe now, before this next route does. By 2025, Paul Farrelly was no small player. The seizure that would eventually make headlines, £17 million worth of ketamine hidden in a single van, was likely just one piece of a much larger network. Investigators from Merseyside Police and the National Crime Agency described operations of this scale as part of an organized system, supply lines stretching across motorways, warehouses, and legitimate-looking front companies. Farrelly's movements reflected the dual life many couriers live. By day, he appeared to be an ordinary delivery driver, hauling household goods across the northwest. By night, the phone calls grew quieter, the messages shorter, coded, cautious, and always deliberate. Every run carried risk. But every successful trip brought in more trust, more money, and more expectation. The profits from one haul could change lives, but one wrong turn could end everything. The investigators who later pieced together the chain described it as methodical: vehicles retrofitted with hidden compartments, meeting points chosen for low visibility, and loads disguised under ordinary trade routes. Yet for all the careful planning, the pattern was beginning to emerge. Too many journeys. Too much traffic. Too many eyes watching the same van. The more Farrelly moved, the more attention he drew, from law enforcement, from rivals, and perhaps from within his own network. And somewhere along those routes, one silent observer took notice. The law was closing in. It was the afternoon of the 16th of September 2025, traffic was heavy on the East Lancashire Road, the kind of weekday hum no one remembers, except the officers who made the stop. At 4:30 p.m., a black VW Crafter van caught the attention of Merseyside Police's Matrix Disruption Unit. To any passerby, it was routine, just another van, another stop. But inside that vehicle lay the key to one of the largest ketamine seizures ever recorded in Britain. As the officers approached, the driver, Paul Farrelly, 46, from Farrell, Liverpool, kept his hands on the wheel, breathing unevenly. His story was simple: he was moving kitchen worktops. But the officers had been briefed. They were looking for something specific: a van, a route, a time that matched intelligence from an ongoing National Crime Agency operation tracking synthetic drug imports across the northwest. When the doors swung open, what they found didn't match his story. Inside, 22 white sacks, stacked neatly, each labeled as resin powder. But the texture, the smell, the sheer volume, something wasn't right. A deeper search revealed the van's secret. Hollowed-out kitchen worktops concealing 13 more sacks. Altogether, 35 sacks, weighing 875 kilograms, the largest single ketamine haul in UK history, with a street value of £17 million. As the reality set in, the road that had carried the drugs became the scene of a major criminal breakthrough. What the public didn't see was how long the operation had been building. Weeks of surveillance. Unmarked cars tracking late-night drives between Liverpool, St Helens, and industrial estates in Warrington. Phone intercepts that hinted at a drop, but never revealed who was behind it. The van, it seemed, was just one moving piece in a much bigger puzzle. After his arrest, Farrelly said little. No comment to every question, from who he worked for to who supplied the load. Investigators suspected he was a courier, part of a regional trafficking network using legitimate businesses as covers, furniture imports, logistics, even small construction suppliers. Evidence later showed the drugs were packed professionally, wrapped in multiple layers to mask odor, typical of international supply chains using ports like Liverpool and Hull. As detectives sifted through his phone, they found no obvious messages, no calls, suggesting a burner system, with contacts wiped clean. Someone higher up had prepared for this. Farrelly was expendable, a driver, not a mastermind. Behind the van, other vehicles had moved similar routes in the months before. Police believed this seizure was just one of several shipments, part of a larger criminal enterprise stretching beyond Merseyside. But the silence sealed his fate. No cooperation. No plea deal. Just one man taking the fall for a fortune in narcotics. In court weeks later, the prosecutor described the scene as an operation of industrial scale. The defense offered little beyond the claim that Farrelly was a simple courier. The haul was so vast that even seasoned officers admitted they had never seen anything like it. For the Matrix unit, it was a career-defining bust. For Farrelly, it was the end of a road he'd been traveling for years, a road paved with quiet jobs, hidden compartments, and the illusion that he'd never be caught. But someone, somewhere, had tipped them off. Whether it was an insider, a rival, or a quiet phone call from within the same network, that detail remains buried in the case files. And for Paul Farrelly, the truth is simple: one stop changed everything. The driver stayed silent. The load was seized. And for one man, the road ended right there. After his arrest on the 16th of September 2025, the evidence against Paul Farrelly was overwhelming: 875 kilograms of ketamine, sealed, weighed, and photographed. There was no plea bargain, no negotiation. At Liverpool Magistrates Court, Farrelly pleaded guilty to possession with intent to supply a Class B drug. The courtroom was quiet as the judge read out the charge. This was not just another smuggling case. It was a record-breaking seizure. On the 23rd of October 2025, he was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in prison. The judge described the haul as a deliberate, professional operation on a vast scale. Outside the court, representatives from the National Crime Agency and Merseyside Police called it a major disruption to organised supply lines. Detective Inspector Peter McCullough told reporters, "This seizure has taken a huge amount of harmful drugs out of circulation. The driver was caught, but our work to identify those above him continues. It was a public victory, but also a quiet warning. Because if Farrelly was merely a courier, then the real question remained. Who owned the £17 million worth of ketamine he was moving? Phone records offered few clues. No traceable texts. No bank trails linking to the higher tiers. To investigators, it was proof of a structured network, clean and compartmentalized, where each man knew only his part. Even in prison, Farrelly stayed silent. No statements, no cooperation, no names. His sentence might have closed one file, but for the NCA, it opened another, one pointing toward international suppliers using UK trade routes as their cover. The case stands as one of Britain's largest single ketamine seizures, but it's also a reminder: when one courier is caught, another is waiting in line. The seizure of 875 kilograms of ketamine didn't just stop a shipment, it prevented nearly a ton of the drug from flooding UK streets. According to the National Crime Agency, that single van carried enough ketamine to supply the entire Northwest for months. But behind the victory lay a troubling truth: the trade was far from over. This case exposed just how deeply synthetic drugs had embedded themselves in Britain's underground economy. From Liverpool to Manchester, from club scenes to rural supply routes, the demand never slowed. And as one driver went to prison, another stepped forward to take the wheel. Experts warn that ketamine use in the UK has tripled in the last decade, its purity rising, its reach extending from festivals to inner-city addiction clinics. Police say the supply chains have adapted, using legitimate logistics networks, coded communications, and seemingly ordinary goods to move illicit shipments under the radar. For investigators, the Farrelly case remains both a success and a warning. It showed what could be stopped, but also how much remains unseen. For Paul Farrelly, 5 years of freedom were traded for 5 years behind bars. No riches. No glory. Just a record-breaking haul that helped no one. A reminder that in the world of drug trafficking, the payoff is always temporary, but the cost lasts forever. But behind that single roadside arrest lies a network still operating in silence, adapting, evolving, and hiding behind everyday trade. If this story shook you, subscribe and turn on notifications now, because the next case might reveal just how close this network really is to you.